Tonight, the case against Jeffrey Epstein, the billionaire facing sex trafficking charges, and now the Labor Secretary Alex Acosta and President Trump, they're weighing in. Acosta, he was the U.S. attorney at the time when Epstein got a plea deal in Florida for similar charges. We'll dig into whether this was justice or a miscarriage of it with a former federal prosecutor. Then, another former federal prosecutor will come to the set tonight discussing whether President Trump ought to be charged with obstructing justice. And this is no typical anti-Trumper. He's not even a Democrat. He worked for Ken Starr during the Clinton investigation. He joins us this evening. Then, feuding with a British ambassador, lying about the environment, retweeting a fake story about Ronald Reagan. Just another day in the Trump White House. We'll show you what we mean. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Now we're going to start tonight with a case against Jeffrey Epstein, the politically connected billionaire who just pleaded not guilty to sex trafficking charges. This morning, prosecutors, they're fighting to keep politically connected financier Jeffrey Epstein behind bars. They say he sexually assaulted dozens of young girls at his homes in New York and Florida.
We think he has every incentive to try and flee the jurisdiction, and when you have two planes and you live much of the year abroad, we think that's a very real risk.
Agents raided his $77 million Manhattan mansion. They say they found hundreds of female nude photographs. The indictment claims Epstein recruited girls to, quote, engage in sex acts with him, after which he would give victims hundreds of dollars in cash. Courtney Wald said she was assaulted in Epstein's home when she was only 14.
Just to hear that they're standing up for the victims, you know what I mean? It's just like so overwhelmingly it's past due.
In 2007, Epstein faced similar charges in Florida, but he struck a controversial plea deal, serving only 13 months in jail. The U.S. attorney who authorized that deal in Florida, Alexander Acosta, he is now the Labor Secretary. Today, calls for Acosta to resign, they are growing louder. From 2020 Democratic hopefuls to the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer.
It is now impossible for anyone to have confidence in Secretary Acosta's ability to lead the Department of Labor. If he refuses to resign, President Trump should fire him.
Epstein's political connections are now also in the spotlight. In a 2002 profile in New York Magazine, before any allegations had surfaced, Donald Trump is quoted as saying this about Epstein: "It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. No doubt about it, Jeffrey enjoys his social life." And a spokesperson for former President Bill Clinton released this statement last night, saying the former president, quote, knows nothing about the terrible crimes Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to in Florida or those with which he has been recently charged in New York, saying Mr. Clinton once traveled with Epstein and visited his home, but he has not spoken to Epstein in well over a decade. A judge will decide next week whether Epstein's released on bail. And now Secretary Acosta is commenting finally on the case, of course, on Twitter, saying, "The crimes committed by Epstein are horrific, and I am pleased the New York prosecutors are moving forward with a case based on new evidence. With the evidence available more than a decade ago, federal prosecutors insisted that Epstein go to jail, register as a sex offender, and put the world on notice that he was a sexual predator. Now that new evidence and additional testimony is available, the New York prosecution offers an important opportunity to more fully bring him to justice." President Trump, he was asked about Mr. Acosta, and here's what he had to say.
I feel very badly, actually, for Secretary Acosta, because I've known him as being somebody that works so hard and has done such a good job. And what I do know is that he's been a great, really great Secretary of Labor. The rest of it we'll have to look at. We'll have to look at it very carefully. But you're talking about a long time ago. And again, it was a decision made, I think, not by him, but by a lot of people.
Well, let's bring in the perfect person to talk about what should and shouldn't happen as it relates to prosecutors and the case of Mr. Epstein, former federal prosecutor Mimi Roach. And I should also mention, Mimi just wrote a piece in the Daily Beast called "Jeffrey Epstein Shouldn't Expect to Wriggle Free Again." That talks to the present, and we'll get to the future. But first, let's start in the past. Over a decade ago, Epstein was not charged with some garden variety inappropriate behavior. He was charged with being involved in a sex trafficking ring, all ringing true with the same pattern that we now see in the indictment before him. What happened back in the Southern District of Florida then? Because on the face of it, for somebody who didn't live the life that you did, it seems like to say a miscarriage of justice is to put an antiseptic touch on this thing. It's unbelievable the sweetheart deal this guy got.
And it seems that way to someone in my position as well. This is something that I think you don't have to be a former prosecutor or FBI agent to look at and say, this is really messed up. You know, it's like a doctor who is a specialist in a field, and he could take one look at a patient and say, whoa, someone did a really bad job on this patient. It's just like the equivalent of malpractice, I think. And so one small detail, but I think is worth emphasizing, Epstein actually wasn't charged federally with the sex trafficking in Florida, and that's going to become important in the Southern District case. We know that about the conduct that could have been charged in Florida because of the non-prosecution agreement that Florida reached with him, and because of, frankly, a lot of the excellent reporting that's been done by the Miami Herald recently, and because of an opinion that a judge in Florida recently wrote where she held that the Florida prosecutors violated the Victims' Rights Act in not notifying the victims about the plea deal in the federal case that they reached. So, but it's important to point out that he wasn't actually charged federally. They didn't even get to that step. They had the conduct, they could have charged him, right? And that's why...
And they should have charged him,
right? They should have, yes. Now, look, I am cautious about doing Monday morning quarterbacking on other prosecutors. Nobody knows a case like a prosecutor knows their own case. And it is true in cases where you're dependent on victim witnesses, particularly young women, vulnerable ones, those are hard cases to make. So when... You know, do I think that they had a challenging case? Do I think that they had problems that, you know, would have had to deal with and face in bringing a case like that? Sure. But those are the cases you fight for. Those are the cases you bring. And more importantly, there's so many red flags here that isn't why they didn't bring the case. It isn't because it was a hard case, as Acosta is now trying to say, and that's what really galls me. He's trying to say, well, we didn't have this evidence. That
he showed up for one night a week in prison for an extended period. He got, just to give clarity here, to say he got preferential treatment and the type of sentencing where he was allowed to have a regular life and just show up on Sundays, I guess, to jail, that's, if not unprecedented, he certainly got treatment that regular viewer at home wouldn't have gotten for the same charges.
Right, because what happened is they let him plead to a state prostitution charge. They did not charge, they did not bring, they did not hold him accountable for all of this significant criminal conduct involving a sex trafficking operation that we now can see because we see it charged in the Southern District, and they didn't charge it. And the red flags about why they didn't charge it, it wasn't because it was a hard case, are, number one, they didn't tell the victims that they were making this sweetheart deal for Epstein.
Which they were required
to do under the law. It's the right thing to do, and it's a thing that prosecutors do, particularly when you have human live victims there. You go to them, and even if they're not going to like the plea deal you're giving, you talk about it with them.
So then we get to present day. You heard Acosta stressing new evidence. How much of it do we know at this point is actually new rather than of the hundreds, if not thousands, of photos or old photos? And in answering that, answer the two things that people have asked. Well, wait a minute, what about statute of limitations and what about double jeopardy?
Okay, statute of limitations is not an issue. It can be very complicated, but the most simple way I can explain it is that in 2006, the federal child exploitation laws were amended to essentially eliminate any statute of limitations. So any crime that could have been brought in 2006 is alive after that as well. There's no statute of limitations problem because under the law, as long as it could have been brought at the time that the statute of limitations was eliminated, okay, you can go back that far. So all of the conduct we're talking about now could have been charged in 2006, so it's all fine now. So, I mean, I expect they may raise it, but that is a non-issue really under the law.
And in answering the next question, because they chose not to charge him back then with the federal crime, there is no double jeopardy now.
Exactly. Double jeopardy is a very specific thing that only comes into play when one jurisdiction charges and then another jurisdiction. Even then, when it's stayed in federal, there are ways around it. But here, there will not be a double jeopardy problem because it was never charged federally. The one issue that I think his lawyers will raise, and already have started to even yesterday on the day of his arrest, is that the Southern District is barred by the fact of the plea agreement between Florida and Epstein back in 2008, I believe it was. And what the Southern District of New York has already said, they said it in their bail memo yesterday, and I'm sure, and I think in the press conference, is no, we're not bound by that, because if you look at the language of that non-prosecution agreement between the Southern District U.S. Attorney's Office in Florida and Epstein, it specifies that it is only as it pertains to conduct to the office of the U.S. Attorney in Florida. So it's like a contract. It only binds the parties that it says it's binding, and it only says it's binding them. So, and there's case law that's very sort of helpful in that interpretation that I think will help the Southern District in that.
Let's talk about the Attorney General for a moment. William Barr said, hey, I'm going to stay out of Florida, but I'm not going to recuse myself with what's going on in New York. The Southern District of New York is famous, or I guess depending on perspective, infamous, in that they almost operate as their own entity to a certain degree. If Barr chose to, could the Attorney General put his thumb on the scale with what's happening in New York, or can they act independently?
So I'm going to say the answer is probably somewhere in between. First of all, it's a little unclear to me. Barr first said he was recusing himself, then said, oh no, I'm only recusing myself as to this sort of retroactive look at what they did in Florida in arriving at this plea, because there is now basically some official examination going on of that. But I'm not recusing myself as to what the Southern District is currently doing in the current case. And first of all, I don't see how you draw that line, because some of the challenges that we just discussed that Epstein's lawyers are going to make to this case is, no, this was all done. Look at what the prosecutor said. They knew about this conduct. There's really nothing new here, which I don't think is exactly true, but that's the arguments they're going to make. So it's going to necessarily require sort of diving into what the prosecutors knew, what they did, why they did what they did. And I don't understand how Barr can say, I'll be recused as to one, but not the other. So that seems like a very false line. Second of all, look, they've charged this case so far against Epstein. He's not apparently going to stop that. But there's this sort of looming question out there. Why is this sex trafficking case being run out of the public corruption unit
That's where I was going to go
in
next,
the Southern District of New York? But I think it's relevant to this question. I think, I don't like to speculate. I think it's hard to know right now. We will find out. But one possibility is that actually part of their investigation will include looking at how Florida U.S. Attorney's Office, public officials in that office handled that original plea deal. If that is part of the Southern District case, Bill Barr should not be part of that decision making, and I am worried that he could do something. Particularly when it comes to public corruption type crimes where the Department of Justice, Main Justice as we call it, has more authority over prosecutorial offices around the country and what they can and cannot charge.
People at home certainly know about cooperating agreements, but given the, not just the serious, but the egregious allegations against Epstein and some of the horrific behavior against minors that he's alleged to have done, usually there's no plea agreements, but if there is, it's got to be seismic in terms of what you'd be giving up and other figures. And obviously, all the speculation unfounded to this point as to who else may not be involved. But I think I saw in your piece, you only can remember a couple times in 16 plus years where there's been ever any kind of plea agreement here where you can cut a deal. He's not a young guy. He very possibly could be looking at a life sentence behind bars if convicted of this. He'd have to be giving up something, as I said, really substantial here to even be considered to work out a deal, right?
Yes, absolutely. If we're talking about a cooperation agreement, absolutely. Which is different from if he wanted to just plead guilty, where you do get some kind of benefit. It's not going to be the slap on the wrist kind of benefit.
No, but if he's going to cooperate and give up
but
names,
if he wants to cooperate, right? I literally can remember only 2 times in my 16 years where this type of a person charged with this type of crime, like child exploitation type crime, was allowed to enter into a cooperation agreement, because it is such heinous conduct. It is really a top priority. It's the kind of conduct where you have victims that you look in the face and say, we think this information is worth more than, I mean, to them it sounds like you're saying this information that they're giving us is worth more than the pain that was caused to you, and you don't want to have to do that. So you're really, really, really not going to want to give any kind of cooperation benefit to someone unless the information they have is really probably going to help you catch other kinds of child predators, other people who are dangers to the community in that way. So that's been my experience, that he would have to have incredibly valuable information.
Mimi, as always, thank you so much. When we come back, everyone, one of Ken Starr's top attorneys during the Clinton investigations speaking out about the president and the rule of law today, and what he's saying may surprise you. He'll join us after the break.